We get this question a lot, so I thought I'd answer it here, and that question is, how does an application associate an end user with a connection? That's a great question because it's at the heart of how you use the Unified API, and in this video, we'll show you how. In order for your application to access an end user's account on a SaaS application, that end user must authorize your application to access their account. When the end user provides that authorization, it creates a connection in Unified.to. Now, a connection is an object that represents the end user's permission or authorization to use an integration to a SaaS application so that your application can access their account on the SaaS application. Now, you're probably wondering, how does your application get the end user's authorization to use their account on a SaaS application? And the answer is the Embedded Authorization component. It displays the logos for all the SaaS applications for which your application has Unified.to integrations. We have React, Angular, and Vue.js versions of the Embedded Authorization component that you can use in your application. Or, if you prefer building applications with vanilla JavaScript, we've got you covered with a script that will render the component. And finally, for you hardcore do-it-yourselfers, you can simply call our API to get an array of your application's integrations and write your own code to render the component if that's your thing. And how does authorization happen? Well, your application displays the Embedded Authorization component. I've got one on my screen right now, and this one is displaying a lot of logos because I just wanted to demonstrate how many SaaS applications Unified.to integrates with. The user's presented with these, perhaps not as many as I'm showing right now, but when it's time for the user to authorize your application to communicate with the SaaS application, they click on the logo for the SaaS application that they want to authorize and then enter some kind of credential. Usually it's an API key or a username or password, or in the case of an application like Google, they would select the Google identity that they want to use. If the end user enters the right credentials, then they're returned to your application via the success URL. Now, the success URL includes the ID of the connection object, which is created as a result of the end user granting authorization. The ID of the connection object, also known as the connection ID, is the key to accessing the user's account on a SaaS application from that point on. Let's suppose your application needs to access an end user's data from a SaaS application. Your application makes a call to Unified.to. Let's say this call is named getUserData. One of the parameters that your application must provide is the ID for the end user's connection to the SaaS application. That connection ID lets Unified.to look up the connection object, and that connection object represents the end user's authorization to access their account. The end user's authorization allows the call to be made to the SaaS application, and the SaaS application replies by fulfilling the request, which in this case is the end user's data. So, how does your application get the end user's connection ID? Well, there are three ways. The first method for associating an end user with the connection is to use the state parameter. This is the method we recommend, which is why we're showing it first. In this method, your application encodes the end user ID into the Embedded Authorization component's state parameter. State is one of the properties of the React, Angular, and Vue.js versions of the Embedded Authorization component, and it's a parameter in the URL for the vanilla JavaScript version. When the end user clicks on a SaaS application logo in the Embedded Authorization component, they're sent to the page where they authorize access to their account on the SaaS application. When the end user authorizes your application to use the account, they're returned to your application via the success URL. Now, the success URL includes a couple of parameters, and the first is state, and it contains the exact same value as the state parameter you provided to the Embedded Authorization component. So, if you encoded the end user ID into the original state parameter, you can decode it from this state parameter that you get back through the success URL. Now there's another parameter in the success URL. It's the ID parameter. This is the ID for newly created connection objects, which is now in Unified.to's records. Your application can grab this connection ID and it should add it to the end user's record so that it can access their account on the corresponding SaaS application. With this approach, the information about an end user and their connection ID for an integration is in one place immediately after the connection is created. This is why this is the method we recommend for associating an end user with their connection ID for an integration. Okay, enough diagrams. Let's get out of theory land and get into real life. I am in the Unified Control Panel. I'm currently looking at the dashboard right now. Let's get a look at the Embedded Authorization component. And you do that by going to the Settings menu and selecting Embedded Authorization. That takes you to this page, which allows you to configure the Embedded Authorization component. The Embedded Authorization page has two halves, the left and the right. The left side has all the configuration stuff, and the right side has the end user preview, which allows you to see what the Embedded Authorization component would look like in your application when it's time for the end user to authorize access. The configuration section contains fields for key parameters that go into the Embedded Authorization component. Now let's take a look at the first two fields, the success URL and failure URL fields. They specify where the end user gets redirected to after they've authorized your application to access their account on the SaaS application. Now, the success URL is for when authorization was successful, which results in Unified.to creating a connection object, and you want that connection object's ID. That's what the point of this video is. The failure URL, on the other hand, is for when authorization was not successful. This happens when the user either enters the wrong credentials or cancels the authorization process. We will look at the state and external ID fields in good time, but what I should show you first is the embedded code section. And what this does is it presents you with code that you can copy and paste into your application for the embedded authorization component. Now, there is code for React, for Angular, for Vue.js, or vanilla JavaScript. There is also a snippet called API, and that's for those of you who like to roll your own components. Let's talk about the state field. Now, the state field allows you to enter a value that will go into the Embedded Authorization component's state parameter, and you get the same value back in the success URL from its state parameter. So, in other words, if you encode the end user ID in the state parameter for the Embedded Authorization component, you can then decode it from the state parameter of the success URL. The state parameter can be set to any value that can be expressed as a URL-friendly string, which includes JSON objects, such as the one like this. Now, encoded as a base64 string, it looks like this. Now, we strongly recommend that you add some kind of security, like a hashtag signature, into the value that you put into the state parameter, and then use base64 encoding on that encrypted value. So, for example, here's a JSON object, and here's what it would look like as a base64 encoded string. That is what you should put into the state parameter. Let's set the state parameter right now, and what I'm going to do is, instead of entering a long, mysterious base64 encoded string, I'm going to enter something obvious, and the reason will become clear in just a moment. I am going to enter this value into state base64 encoded and user ID. And the reason I'm going with something a little more readable is I want you to see what it looks like in the embedded code. So I am going to select the React component. Whatever changes I make to configuration will be reflected in the embedded code. So if I copy the React component here from the embedded code widget and then paste it into my trusty code editor, you can see that the state parameter is included as part of the embedded authorization component. The configurations you make become part of the end user preview, and we can take it out for a spin right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to authorize a connection to Google Drive for my account. So I click on the Google Drive logo. The first thing I'm taken to, if I'm on the tester plan, is this page. Basically, if you don't want to see this, upgrade. I'm going to click on continue. And then I'm going to select the account that I want to authorize access to. After which I'm going to have to provide some kind of authorization. Now, this is going to vary from integration to integration. Now, in this case, what I want to do is I just want to say, look, I want the application to only be able to see and download files on my Google Drive. Maybe I don't want it to have full control and see, edit, create, and delete. So I'm just going to authorize see and download. And once that's done, I'm going to click continue. Because this is the end user preview version of the embedded authorization component inside Unified.to, and because I didn't provide a success URL, I got redirected to the default success URL, which is the connections page. Now, the newly created connection object appears at the top of the list of the connections page, and you can see its ID right there. It's in the leftmost column. Now that's great for the human administrator logged into Unified.to, but what about your application? Well, let me direct your attention to the address bar, and more particularly the query section of the URL inside the address bar, which has two parameters. The first one being ID, and notice its value. It is the exact same value as the ID value for the newly created connection object. The other parameter you should notice is state, and it contains the exact same value as the value you put into the state parameter for the embedded authorization component. Now, once again, we recommend this method for associating a user with their connection ID for an integration. And the reason for this is it gives you both the user ID and the connection ID at the same time and in the same place. And at this point, all your application has to do is copy the connection ID into the record for that user. The second method for associating an end user with their connection ID is to use the external ID parameter. Now, with this approach, you're storing the user ID in the connection objects record on Unified.to instead of storing it in the end user object record in your application. If your application uses the React, Angular, or Vue.js version of the embedded authorization component, then the external ID parameter's name is external_xref, short for external cross-reference. If you're using the vanilla JavaScript version or rolling your own authorization component, its URL parameter is UID, short for user ID. When the end user clicks on a SaaS application logo in the embedded authorization component, they're sent to the page where they authorize your application to access their account on the SaaS application. After authorization, they're returned to your application via the success URL. No surprise there, not that different from the state method. But when using external ID, the success URL doesn't return any information about the end user. All it returns is the connection ID in the ID parameter. So the question becomes, how do you know which connection belongs to an end user so that you can get that connection's ID? The answer is that the value you put into the external ID parameter of the embedded authorization component, that value is part of the connection record, and you use the admin API of Unified.to to look it up. Your application uses the value of an end user ID for the external_xref parameter of the Unified.to admin API's list all connections function. This function returns an array of connection objects whose external ID value matches that external_xref parameter. For instance, if you set the value of external_xref to end_user_ID, you'll get an array of connection objects whose external ID value is end_user_ID. Each of those connection objects will have an ID property. That is, the ID you'll need to provide when making an API call to the SaaS integration for that end user. With the external ID approach, your application doesn't have to store the connection ID for an end user's integration with the SaaS application. Instead, it has to perform a lookup before accessing an end user's account on that SaaS application. Let's go back to the embedded authorization page and create a connection, but this time using the external ID parameter. Now, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to use an easy to spot value for external ID and user ID. Now, I'm going to now copy the code for the React version of the embedded authorization component and paste it into my code editor. And as you can see, the external href parameter, the external ID parameter, is there inside the component. As I mentioned earlier, JavaScript has a slightly different parameter name for external ID. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the JavaScript component into my code editor. And notice that it is UID instead. Make a note of that if you're using the vanilla JavaScript version. And it's time to take embedded authorization for another test drive. Once again, we are using external ID set to this value and underscore user underscore ID. So I'm going to click on Google Drive in the end user preview. I'm going to click past tester plan and then select the account for which I want to authorize. And once again, Google will ask for my authorization. Notice that the application already has some access because we did that just prior using the state parameter, but I'm just going to say yes. So this is going to create another connection for the same user. I'm going to click continue. And I am returned to the success URL. And since I'm in Unified, the success URL is the connections page. And you can see a brand new connection at the top of the list. This is the connection I just created. This is its ID. And that ID is reflected in the success URL's ID parameter up here if you look at the address bar. But also note that there is an external ID column in the connections list. And look, here is the value that I set external ID to, and underscore user underscore ID, which represents the user ID that I want to associate with the connection. To get the user ID associated with the connection, your application uses the Unified.to admin API. There is a command to list connections, and I've got it on my screen right now. This is Python. It's pretty much the same in other programming languages. If I run it, I am going to get a list of all the connections. Notice the IDs of the connections there, ending in 3426 and 347F, and that matches this list here on my connections page, 3426 and 347F. Now, what I want to do is I only want to find those connections associated with that user ID I provided. So if I add the external underscore xref parameter to the call to get list connections, I will get only those connections whose external ID is end user ID, and that's how I get the user ID associated with a connection when using the external ID parameter. And finally, the third method, the session cookie plus ID parameter method. Now, with this approach, your application doesn't set any parameters for the embedded authorization component. It simply displays the component. Now, this approach counts on the fact that your application knows who the current end user is via the information in the session cookie. Once again, the end user clicks on a SaaS application logo in the embedded authorization component. They're sent to the page where they authorize access to their account on the SaaS application, and they're returned to your application via the success URL. As mentioned earlier, your application knows the end user's ID via the session cookie, And the connection ID is contained in the success URL's ID parameter. So, just like the state parameter method, your application should add this connection ID from the success URL to the end user's record so that it can access their account on the corresponding SaaS application. And there you have it, the 3 methods for associating an end user in an application with their connection to a SaaS integration in Unified.to. And once again, they are method 1, encoding the user ID in the state parameter, so you have both the end user ID and the connection ID in the success URL after user authorization. Method number 2 is storing the user ID in the external ID parameter so you can use it to look up the end user's connection in Unified.to's connections database. And then finally, method 3, using your session cookie to get the user ID and matching it with the connection ID from the success URL. So, we hope this video was helpful to you, and we hope you enjoy using Unified.to. Happy coding!